case first. A bearded McDuff appeared in court in July 1992 for arraignment on capital murder charges.
Mr. McDuff, how do you wish to plead to the allegation?
Not guilty.
Because of heavy publicity, McDuff's court-appointed attorney requested and received a change of venue. In February 1993, a Houston courthouse became the setting for McDuff's second capital murder trial.
The evidence is going to show you in this case that there were only two people who were the witnesses to the death of Melissa Ann Northrup, one being Melissa Ann Northrup, and the second was Kenneth Allen McDuff. So it is a circumstantial case.
During testimony, cameras were allowed to record only pictures and no sound. One of the first witnesses for the prosecution was Kenneth McDuff's mother, Addie, now 77 years old and in frail health. She had been subpoenaed to testify as a hostile witness. She confirmed that her son used her credit card. Receipts showed McDuff was in the Waco area the night of the abduction. McDuff objected to his mother being called to take the stand against him.
I didn't personally want her to come because of her health, but the district attorney insisted on it.
In court, McDuff became agitated when two former friends testified that he used drugs and once tried to talk them into robbing the convenience store where Northrup worked.
Kenneth is firmly convinced, and as are we, that these people are not telling the truth. And it's hard to listen to.
McDuff began to get impatient, even with his own lawyers.
One time during the trial, he threw a pencil across the room and said, "Why don't you sit on the prosecutor's side? You're helping them more than you are me." And I had conversation after conversation with Kenneth about, look, you got to keep your cool.
But McDuff complained to reporters that his attorneys weren't following his orders.
My attorneys want to ask the questions I requested for them to ask of the witnesses.
What are they doing wrong?
Well, they just go through the motions.
McDuff soon had more reason to be upset when the judge allowed the testimony of Alva Hank Worley, his confessed accomplice in the murder of Colleen Reed, a crime for which he had not yet been tried.
I think it's going to be very inflammatory and not give me a fair trial in the present case.
The prosecution argued that Worley's testimony would establish a pattern of conduct. Showing McDuff murdered Reed would help prove he murdered Northrup.
It's called signature crimes, to show the similarities, to show that this was McDuff's signature, the way he committed his murders.
Prosecutors said there were many similarities between the two crimes, including the way the two victims looked, and that shoelaces had been used to tie up both women. In February 1993, a nervous Alva Hank Worley arrived at the courthouse.
I'm scared to death of that fella.
Why are you so scared?
I'm scared of him.
Worley's testimony about the murder of Colleen Reed would not turn out to be the worst problem for the defense. That came when Kenneth McDuff insisted on taking the stand.
I spent days, literally, trying to get him not to testify. Under the rules of evidence, if he did not testify, then his past criminal convictions for the 3 murders in '66 wouldn't have come into the courtroom.
McDuff ignored his lawyer's advice and took the stand. For 2 hours, he spun a rambling tale.
It was just a fairy tale that he tried to explain everything away, that he'd gone to San Antonio and he got a truck driver to haul him somewhere, and he got off in Kansas and he got a train. It's just stupid.
During McDuff's testimony, prosecutors brought up the brutal broomstick killings, describing McDuff as a murderer by occupation. It took jurors only 4 hours to reach a decision.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Kenneth Allen McDuff, guilty of capital murder as charged in the indictment.
During the sentencing phase, the prosecution said there was only one appropriate punishment.
You look Kenneth McDuff in the eye and say, you deserve the death penalty for your heartless, brutal, soulless acts.
The defense requested life in prison for the ex-con.
Mr. McDuff knows how to do time. He functions well in a highly structured environment.
It took the jury about an hour to decide his fate. McDuff showed no emotion as he heard the judge read the sentence.
I assess your punishment at death by lethal injection.
McDuff maintained his innocence as he was led from court.
I'm sorry about what happened, but I wasn't the one who did it.
A year later, in 1994, McDuff received a second death sentence for the murder of Colleen Reed, even though her body had not been found. Following the verdict, Melissa Northrup's mother, Brenda Solomon, hugged Colleen's sister, Lori Bible. McDuff could not control himself as he was led from the courtroom.
Settle down, fella. This ain't necessary to be hanging on to.
Just want to be there.
By 1994, Kenneth Allen McDuff had received 2 death sentences for the murders of Colleen Reed and Melissa Ann Northrup. McDuff is the only man in Texas history ever sent to death row, paroled, and then sent back for killing again. It had been 7 years since Regina Moore, Brenda Thompson, and Colleen Reed disappeared. Their bodies had not been found. In a 1998 interview, McDuff was still denying involvement in any murder.
Tell them where Colleen Reed is. They still haven't found her body. Is there any way to make amends?
First of all, I would have to know where it was at.
Did you ever kill anybody?
No.
Not even those kids back in 1966?
No. I don't want to see anyone suffer or die. There's so many rights and wrongs, in the world that, it's whose point of view what is right and what's wrong.
Some would say you're the poster child for what is wrong.
And you sure talking to me bad.
As McDuff's execution date drew near, an informant close to the killer offered to try to get him to talk about the locations of the bodies.
Eventually, the informant came back and said, he told me where one was for sure and gave me a good idea on another one.
Kenneth McDuff's directions proved accurate. Regina Moore was found next to a bridge off the side of a highway. In late September 1998, investigators videotaped the recovery of her skeletal remains. Moore's hands had been tied behind her back with shoelaces. Her ankles were bound with stockings.
It looks like it's wound around both of them and back around the back of them. But
you can only imagine what her last minutes or moments on this earth were like at the hands of Kenneth McDuff.
McDuff also revealed where he buried Brenda Thompson. Assistant U.S. Attorney Bill Johnston followed McDuff's directions to a heavily wooded area just outside Waco.
I just chose to dig in one little place. About a foot down, I hit something hard and got down on my hands and knees, and it was a bone.
Brenda Thompson was buried about a foot deep, lying face down. One woman was still missing, Colleen Reed. She was the one McDuff wouldn't give up.
In fact, McDuff said to the informant, if I give them Colleen Reed, they won't need me anymore. He said, they'll take away my commissary, they won't treat me right. This is a guy who's going to be executed in 2 weeks. I mean, it's preposterous anyway, but that's the way he thought.
A meeting with officials was arranged. They assured McDuff that he wouldn't lose prison privileges, and he began talking.
He began telling us with great detail how to find Colleen Reed. It was where he had grown up, near the Brazos River.
Investigators searched for hours with heavy digging machinery, but still found nothing. That afternoon, desperate officials secretly arranged to bring McDuff to the site.
It was a high-security, clandestine move off a death row with several investigators and a couple of different vehicles.
Although the terrain had changed, McDuff pointed the search team in the right direction.
He knew immediately. He said, tell them to move one blade length. They moved up one blade length, and the next thing, she was found. So, I mean, he knew within a few feet.
The remains of Colleen Reed were removed from the ground 7 years after she was abducted from a car wash in Austin. Back on death row in Huntsville, prison investigator John Moriarty spent more than 40 hours with McDuff in his final days.
He did admit to murdering 8 persons. That included the 3 juveniles in '66 and 5 adult females since his release on parole. But we strongly suspect there were a lot more.
After a final delay, his execution date was set for November 17th, 1998. Just after 6 p.m., 52-year-old Kenneth McDuff was led into the death chamber and strapped to a gurney. Investigator John Moriarty says that's the only time he ever saw McDuff show emotion.
The veins in his neck, the arteries in his neck were just pounding. I mean, just pulsating, you know, just, he was scared. I thought at some point maybe McDuff would show some remorse, but he never did. He was cold-blooded, cold-hearted, and evil to the very end.
His last words were, "I'm ready to be released. Release me." To the very end, he considered himself the victim.
He didn't die a horrible death, no way. He died an easy death.
His death was nothing compared to the death that he put all these women through, including my daughter. They died horrific deaths. All he did was go to sleep.
The crimes of Kenneth McDuff reached far beyond the families of his victims. The public demanded that the state fix a parole system that let violent criminals like McDuff back on the streets. During the 1990s, Texas overhauled its justice system. The changes became known as the McDuff laws. The state mandated tougher sentences and a complete retooling of parole practices. Texas also built more prisons, $2 billion worth.
The people of Texas and the legislature responded by building the largest prison system, some say, in the history of the free world. They responded by creating an atmosphere of incredible intolerance towards criminals, especially murderers.
The body of Kenneth Allen McDuff was never claimed by his family. He is buried at the prison in Huntsville, his gravestone marked only by his death row number. But Texas will never forget him.
Kenneth McDuff will be remembered as the evil earthquake that shook the foundation of the prison system and the parole system to its base. And out of it, the most sweeping changes in the history of Texas have come. And how ironic that such good